Well, hey, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you today. This morning we are going to continue with our series on mindset, but before we do that, let me tell you a couple things. First of all, in case it's your first time here or first time during the series, Steve is taking some vacation time, and he'll be back in a few weeks, so I just want to express my thanks that you let me come up here and do this so that he can take a break. We really appreciate that. So, the other thing that I want to express is the baptism. So one of the things that we were really excited about in doing some baptisms this morning was because we wanted you to see it. We know that we do this on Wednesday nights, the first Wednesdays, and we know that you don't always get a chance to see what that actually looks like. And so being able to do this on a Sunday morning so that you can kind of see it and see what it involves and that, you get wet, that's it. And then you go, bring a towel. And it's very, informal. So but we're talking about how to find out more about that later. But you can just email baptism@spoutsprings.org if that's something you're interested in, which I hope you are if you haven't done that yet. So, now, mindset. What we're doing right now is we're going through the book of Philippians. And what I'm going to be doing today is talking to you about the second chapter and humility. And one of the things that I find over and over and over again is, and I need to warn y'all, I have got so much to say about this. There's really, that was, really lost y'all on that one, didn't I? So I hope y'all have any plans this afternoon. But I'm still going to keep it to normal length, but my head is just abuzz with so much that can be shared here because this is one of those passages of Scripture that we kind of read and just kind of glide through without really thinking about it. And one of the things that I find in the world is that there are so many things out there that puts us in competition with one another, where we are told that we should pursue ourselves and our happiness and what we want more than anything else. We should pursue our own self-esteem, that we should, and we're constantly, it just seems like we're looking for reasons why we might be better than someone else, whether it's our looks or how much money we make, or education, just all kinds of things. One time, I had, and this was early into my time here, this is, 6-7 years ago, and I was doing the summer series. I had preached my sermons, and I was stepping off the stage. I had just done the last one. This is when we were still meeting over in the tent building. And I come off the stage, and a guy meets me there, and he says, "So, hey, Barry, is this your last sermon?" And I said, "Yeah, it sure is." And he leans in real close and he says, "Well, that's too bad because I prefer you over Steve." And that might be funny, but that's not the point. Because one of the things that drive, if you like my preaching, awesome. But if you're going to downgrade, thank you. If you're gonna downgrade or push down my pastor and friend, we're going to have an issue. And this guy who I had known for a while wasn't my favorite person in the world already, and so that really didn't help things. This is the part you are not going to believe. 30 seconds later, I walked from the stage, I walked to the back of the room, and there's a lady standing there. And she comes up to me and she says, "So Pastor Barry, is Pastor Steve going to be back next week?" And I said, "Yeah, he sure is." And she said, "Good." A human being said that to me. And I said, "Oh?" She said, "Yeah, you're okay, but it's just not the same. There's no law that says we have to talk. You could go take this time to search for your soul." You'll notice I was a lot more upset about her comment than the first one. And let me tell you, I love that story for 1,000 reasons. First of all, the first thing I did is I went to Steve and I told him exactly what happened. Because he and I are not in competition. And I've been in a position where I was a staff, I was under a lead pastor, and for reasons that I was not told or even told that we were in a competition. You know what happens when you're in a competition and you don't know about it? You lose. Every time. It would be like I just walked up to you and said, hey, I played you in Monopoly last night. You were the shoe, and you lost. It makes no sense. And it really dampened the ministry in a lot of ways. I can tell you this. You better believe I throw that in that woman. She still attends here. She's not here today probably, but I throw that in her face every chance I get. Hey, you remember that time you pulled me aside and told me I suck? I didn't say it like that. Tomato, tomato. Hey, is your husband around? I mean, you're okay, but... And happy Mother's Day. So, the other thing that I want to tell you is about that first guy. After a while, he left. I've had people say to me, you know what, Pastor Barry, and it's been in this church, it's been in every ministry I've been in. Pastor Barry, if you leave this church, I'm leaving too. You know what they end up doing? Leaving long before I do. Because I guarantee you at some point, I am going to disappoint you. They were there for the wrong reason. And it really is, and this is kind of mirroring back to what I talked about last week about how it needs to be gospel first. I guarantee you, if you're here just because, and you have that mindset of he has to be here, whether it's one of the pastors or someone else, your time here is just, it's on a timer. We need to be here because of Christ. Anyway, moving on. The idea of humility. And like I said, there's a lot I can say about this, but we're going to be taking a look at Philippians, chapter 2, starting at verse 1. There's a link up here. It's also in your bulletin if you want to follow the notes online. If you've got a Bible, there's the page number. But what I'm going to do first is I just want to walk through the passage and just pull a few things from it. Okay? So, first thing we see is this. Is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? And just remember, this is the Apostle Paul. He's speaking to the church in Philippi. He's already told them about the importance of the gospel, and now he's moved on to this subject. Is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? Any comfort from his love? Any fellowship together in his spirit? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? In other words, if what Christ has done for you has moved you in any way, then you should be doing the following. Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, and working together with one mind and purpose. In other words, church, remember, the gospel comes first. Okay? Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Can you imagine how many problems we could fix in this world if people just started adopting this? Just these two verses. And let me go ahead and explain what humility is. Humility isn't just this complete negligence of yourself. It's not talking up, making yourself into, just complete disregard. I'm not important, that kind of thing. That's not what humility is. We're talking about what it is in a little bit. But it isn't just a complete abandonment of your interests and what which is impossible for us to do anyway. But it is a constantly understanding. It's constantly understanding that we should be looking out towards, with concern, genuine love, and a goal of serving others. Okay? That's what humility is. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. So basically what that means is, yes, he was God, fully God, but when he came to earth, he gave up some of those outward embodiments that God has, so that he took the form of just a normal human being, which he goes on to say. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges and took the humble position of a slave. Not slave in the sense that we often think, but just he was a servant who did what God told him to do. And was born as a human being when he appeared in human form. He humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. The most shameful on a cross, the most shameful way to die. Understand that people that died on a cross, they were given no empathy. They were given absolutely, there was no concern. It was a shameful way to die. Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In other words, God proclaimed him, along with himself, as the object, the ultimate object of worship by his will, by his own declaration. That Christ, because of what he did, he is worthy of our worship, he is worthy of our praise. And what Paul is trying to, and you can see why, as you when we kind of slow down and walk through it, we, just a little bit at a time, we're reminded of some certain things. But very often, this is one of those, if you've been to Sunday school for any amount of time, you're going to realize, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be humble, and yeah, I know Jesus died on the cross, and yeah, we're supposed to worship, And these are just kind of things that just kind of glance over. We've heard it before. But the more understanding we have of this passage and what it really means about what Christ did, and how we are to follow that example, what that looks like here on earth in our everyday lives, that's when we really begin to understand what humility is, both not just in concept, but in practice as well. And so as we come to that understanding that things are really going to change, okay? And so from this passage, I just want to pull a few things that I want to share with you, for you to just kind of take home and think about, okay? Because I guarantee you, I certainly have been. The more I've been digging into this passage, the more I realize there are some areas in my life that, well, they need a checkup. You know what I mean? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. First is this. Humility is others-focused. Humility is others-focused. We see in those passages where he says, to love one another, to look out for the concerns of others, take an interest in others, not just your own, and how that's where our focus needs to be. And in our society, that is really difficult. That is really hard to do because we're constantly told, no, you're number one, look out for whatever makes you happy. How many times do we hear that? Follow your heart. What does that even mean? Just pursue whatever makes you happy. And there's very little do you hear, but stop, make sure you're not destroying others, make sure that you're not undermining others, make sure you're not. That's rarely said. And so we live in this world that is constantly telling us to push ourselves out to the forefront. And yet, it really doesn't help, to be quite honest. There's a great story. It's one of my favorites. There's a lady who had an interview with two politicians. She was going to meet with both of them on the same day. So they met at a coffee shop or something along those lines, and she has the first interview and takes her little notes, and then she meets with the second politician, takes her little notes. And then she goes back to her boss/editor, and he asks her, so how did it go? And she said, the first man that I met with, he made me believe that he was the most important person in the world. And she said, and the second person I met with made me believe that I was the most important person in the world. Now, who would you want to spend more time with? Who would you like to emulate? Who is it of those two is going to have more people gravitate towards them and support them? One of the things that I find is that the more we try to elevate ourselves, very often, not only does it repel people, but they also have a tendency to try and pull you down. And the more that we let our skills, our actions just speak for themselves, very often they tend to elevate us completely on their own. One of the things that I try to tell the girls all the time, because I've got two young girls, 13 and 15. And yeah, pray for me. And of course, they're going through the whole image thing and how they look and how they should look. And one of the things that I try to teach them over and over and over again is that there's being pretty and there's being attractive. And they are worlds apart. Pretty fades. Being attractive does not. And I have so many examples of that, and I'm sure you do too. We have to realize that humility is this constant looking outwards. And what we do in order to build that humility, it's not just, oh, I need to be humble. It's about changing our focus. And any psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor worth his salt, if somebody is completely wrapped up in themselves, one of the first things they will tell them is, then you need to be thinking about other people. Go out, and don't just think about them, go out and do something for someone else. If you want to get depressed, I mean super depressed, go home and just think about yourself. Yeah, and I mean, that wasn't an insult. It's just the way it works, We just start to kind of wind down and we just think about our shortcomings, all these other kind of things, and it just leads to depression. And if you want to think more highly of yourself, if you want to have this elevation of not just these bouts of feeling good just to feel good, but sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose, a sense of just contentment, do something for someone else. Not just the concept, but the actions of humility are built in the discipline of service. And Jesus, he came to earth seeking our best, not his. That was the whole reason he came, is so that he could seek out our very, very best and pay the ultimate price so that we could have it. The ultimate act of service, which is why he is the ultimate example of humility. That outward focus, it comes from action. Another thing that we see is this. Humility is exemplified in Christ, as we've already discussed. He goes on to say about how we should follow the example that Christ set. And what was crazy about this concept is that very much like our world, in the Greco-Roman world, the virtue of humility was not sought after. It is not something that they pursued. And yet Christ made it one of the very cornerstones of his ministry. And it was as his disciples did it that they saw them doing the same things that he... The word Christian actually comes from the original Greek, which means little Christ. It's like a Christ Jr. And they got that term because they said, Christ, he's not around anymore, but there's all these little Christs running around. And they were doing the things that he told them that they should do. And they saw that. They saw that as an extension of what he was. And one of the things that we also find is that Jesus not only came so that he not only came for the purpose of our best, but he also came under the complete authority of God. One of the things that you find if you read through the book of John, one of his favorite themes was the idea of the hour. And Jesus said over and over and over, he talked about it over and over again, my hour, meaning that it has not yet come, or it is coming, or it has come. He says in John, in chapter 2, mine hour is not yet come. Chapter 7, his hour was not yet come. That's John speaking. Chapter 8, his hour was not yet come. Chapter 12, the hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Chapter 13, Jesus knew that his hour was come. 17, Jesus speaking, Father, the hour has come. It's the idea of this divinely appointed thing. And it wasn't just in the timing that Jesus submitted to God, but in everything that he did and said as well. One of the things that you see over and over again as you read through the gospel, he says, everything I do and everything I say is because that is what my Father in heaven has told me to do and say. And he completely subjects himself to the authority of the Father and does everything that he calls him to do. And that is something that I know that all of us don't do as well as we would like. We all have these areas where we wish we did a little bit better when it comes to growing into that image of Christ. There are things that we wish we did a little bit more better. I know that's bad grammar. But anyway, I'm going to hear about it from the teachers at the end. But just the idea of doing what it is that God has called us to do, just that very simple act, is something that we have to really be thinking about on a regular basis. So many of us, and so many of you come here, and I know the questions because I had them too, and I've heard them over and over again, where you ask, okay, the Bible talks about this feeling of contentment. Where is it? The Bible talks about these feelings of joy. Where are they? They talk about the fruit of the Spirit, of patience and kindness, of love. Where are they? Why am I not feeling them? Well, a lot of times it's because we're simply not doing what it is that God has called us to do. These things he's not going to just fly over you and sprinkle fairy dust on you. There's things that we have to do. God's promises often come with conditions. And we have to realize that there are things that we should be doing, and a lot of times it just falls into that one very simple word, obedience. What is it that God is calling you to do, calling us to do? What is the next thing that he is calling us to do that we've just kind of, maybe later? One of the reasons that we ask people to get baptized is because that right there, those three people this morning, they took the very first step of obedience to Christ. That's what that is. I think I tell people all the time, when you get baptized, nothing weird happens. You don't get the Holy Spirit. You don't get more of God's love. You don't get more resolve. You don't get more, you don't get, nothing happens. People find out that you're saved and you get wet. That's it. Those are the only two things that happen. But it's an important, very, very important step because it is the first step in obedience. And I've seen people, they will fight it for months, but they will finally give in because they realize this is something they were supposed to do. I'll never forget, there was one woman that she had a lot of phobias, a lot of issues. She would, bless her heart, I felt so bad for her. Whenever she would have to drive, there were certain places, certain streets that she could drive on and feel okay. Whenever she had to drive off of one of those streets, she would just get nervous and scratch herself to the point where she bled. She had a fear of crowds. One time she came into the back of the sanctuary and sat down because she wanted to sit in the back before anybody got here, and as people came in, she could get used to them being among them. And one time they just came in too quick. And she just had a panic attack. But she got baptized. She said, I've been putting this off for months. I've been scared. And I said, I know you're scared, and trust me, you don't have to explain that to me at all. But it's still an important step. And she did it because she knew the importance of that obedience. Christ is our example in humility and servitude, in obedience. And when you really begin to understand that passage about what he did for us, that's when we really begin to say, yeah, Christ is that example of humility that we need to follow. Last thing I want to share with you is this. Humility is ultimately rewarded by God. And this is one of those points that I really wish I had made a little bit longer. Humility is ultimately rewarded by God, meaning by God and not by people, and God does it in his way and in his timing. You probably didn't want to hear that. God rewards us, people do not. And he does it, he blesses us in his way and in his timing. There's a couple of passages, because, in the passage that we read up here in verses 9 through 11, it talks about how he rewarded Jesus. But there's other passages throughout the Bible that talks about this as well. James 4:10 says, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honor." In Luke 14:11, it says, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." One of the things that I just read about this article, and this is something that's been discussed a million times, and this whole issue of self-esteem and how a group of people got together and decided, you know what, if we just make sure everybody works on their self-esteem, the world will be a magical place. There'll be less crime, less drug use, less this, less that. In fact, this was around the 80s or 90s, I believe, maybe the 80s. And in California, they actually put together self-esteem teams to go out and make sure that self-esteem was filtered into the curriculum in schools and in every facet of life that they could possibly reach. And then as they began to study the effects in the 90s and in the aughts, they realized, hey, you know what? This doesn't work. And it just completely fell apart. And there's a lady named Jennifer Crocker. She's been studying this concept of self-esteem for 40 years. And she has a name for it, this idea that self-esteem, when we strive to build our self-esteem on the comments and praises and platitudes of others, she calls it contingent self-esteem, meaning that I'm not going to feel good unless somebody else is doling out praise. And she says this about it: "A fixation on getting those brief hits of pleasure, especially if they're contingent on other people saying nice things about you," she said, "could instead make us miserable, adding anxiety and depression. Because there's always another person who could be judging you, and they could have a higher standard or a different standard altogether." It's very odd being a pastor. There are people that, they barely know me, and they think I am the greatest thing since Spice Racks. They're just, you are just, Pastor Barry. I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know. What? Am I glowing? What are you looking at? I'm just a human being. And then I have people, keeping in mind that I am a white, male, Christian pastor, there are people who, they don't like me so much. They don't care for me a lot. I've been called some pretty horrible things, one of which I had to look up in Urban Dictionary. It was gross. But just this idea that if we try to depend on others for those feelings, it is only going to lead to some very terrible places. We have to realize that contentment really does come from God. And those things that we spoke about, just a little about, where is that joy? Where is that feeling of purpose, that feeling of contentment? Well, that comes from God as we do the things that he has called us to do. Sometimes corporately, just as the church, as Christians, and then sometimes individually. There may be something that he's just calling you personally to do. But are we being obedient? Because that's where that comes from. That is where that purpose and that sense of well-being really is derived. And the reason why I think that Paul maybe began in chapter 1, where he talks about, okay, the gospel has to be first. And we talked about this a little bit last week, and how the church, when the gospel is first, and they're not getting wrapped up in these tiny little ridiculous things, but the gospel is first, and how it binds them together so that when they are opposed, they're able to stand up against it because they have the right values. Because here's the thing. When people judge you, they judge you by their values, not yours. When people judge you, they judge you by their values, not yours. And therefore, it is very important that we have the right values. I think it goes without saying that people tend to complicate things, don't they? I mean, like for us, our lives, they just, ask anyone that owns a business. The majority of their money, the majority of their time is spent on their employees. The majority of their success and frustration comes from their employees. Because people, when they're put into the mix, they complicate things. This week, this past Thursday, my wife and my 2 kids, they traveled to Pennsylvania, and I'm a bachelor not a bachelor, don't get weird. I'm alone for 5 days. And as a man who finds himself alone for that length of time, I did what any man would do. I went through the entire house and turned off every single light, knowing it was going to stay off for 5 days. I'm getting tingly just thinking about it. Every dad in here knows what I'm talking about. Right now, at my house, every light off. All of them. And you can't say that. Not if you got kids. I don't know why it is their job, all 3 of them, why they just have this desire to destroy as many light bulbs in the history of their life as they possibly can. Does it release endorphins or something? They're just like, bing, 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 bing. Oh my gosh. Because that's their hobby. Some people scrapbook, they turn on lights. And it drives me nuts. Just like I drive my wife nuts with my hobby, which is trying to eat as many fruits and vegetables as I possibly can without washing them first. Did you wash that? Oh. I like the taste of pesticides. So, when you bring people together, there's always that potential for friction. And one of the reasons, in fact, he mentions it in chapter 4, right at the beginning, there were 2 women that were having some kind of disagreement. Probably not a typical disagreement, obviously, because he felt like he should address it. Obviously, it was something that had reached him and he found out about. So there was some level, as there is in any group of people, there was some level of discontent, some disunity, some discord. And so that's just typical. In fact, one of the very first obstacles that the early church, if you read through Acts, the very first obstacle that they had to overcome was some internal fighting. So this is something that just happens. But we have to keep in mind that as we strive to serve others, as we strive to put them first, as we strive to not just think of only our interests, but those of others as well, that discord, it's not going to disappear entirely, but it is something that we can navigate. It is something that we can overcome as we really put our focus on what is most important. One of the things that I want to leave with you is this, is to simply take the time, because let me tell you, there's a lot of soul searching that I've had to do as I've prepared for this sermon. And am I really putting God first? Am I really looking up to him? Because like I said, we all try to find ways where we just try to feel a little bit better than those around us. There's a quote, and this is from C.S. Lewis from his book, Mere Christianity. He says this: "In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you." Take some time to just simply and prayerfully consider, what is it that maybe I need a little bit of an attitude adjustment? Where are some of those areas where I kind of seek the praise of others to my detriment? What are some areas where I'm not putting God first? Where are some areas where I need to be stepping out in obedience, whether to God or just when it comes to the service of others? Just take some time to consider that. Let me also mention that if you are wanting to get baptized or if you're ready to accept Christ as your personal Savior, we have our blue bags. There's some on the back two tables, back by the doors. There's some in the corner of the stage, right over here and right over here. And if you're ready to get saved, you pick one of these up, and somebody will come alongside, and they will unpack this with you. They'll take 8 minutes, and they will explain in very simple terms what it means to be a follower of Christ. And as I said, also, if you're wanting to get baptized, you can pick one of these up as well. Okay. We also have our communion station. There's one in the back, and there's one right over here. If you want to spend some time in prayer, there's usually one right there. Nope, it's over there now. Okay. And if you want to spend some time in prayer, we also have our cross. But it's amazing how very subtle pride is. And I'll never forget, in a Bible study, we were talking about the Pharisee who was praying next to a very common man. And the Pharisee said, Lord, thank you for making me so awesome. That's my translation. While the man next to him prayed for God to forgive him because he was a sinner. And as we talked in the Bible study about that passage, and we were closing in prayer, one person said, and Lord, thank you for not making me like the Pharisee. Do you see how subtle it is? How easily it works its way into our conscience. And really, God is the only one who can shine a light on those areas where that needs to be worked on. Are you willing to just simply go to God and ask, Father, what is it that you would have me work on? What is it that you need me to start doing? What is it so that I am really living out that example of humility and servitude that was set by Christ?